The story of the Coolik and Dreizin family, who came to Taylor County, Georgia in 1918, is a story that movies are made from. They were young Jewish immigrants who came to Georgia via Ellis Island and New York City. This was a conservative, small, middle Georgia community comprised of Baptist and Methodist. The fact that these families were welcomed with open arms was worth exploring. It was mind-boggling when I began to understand the life they built here, the families they produced and raised in Taylor County, and what they accomplished and continue to achieve throughout the United States. They may have come to America because they heard the streets were paved with gold. When they arrived, they found at least three things. First, the streets were not paved with gold. Second, they weren't paved at all. And third, they were expected to pave them. By the way, they did figuratively pave the roads for themselves and every Coolik and Dreizin who came after them. I recently gave a PowerPoint presentation on this story for the Taylor County Historical Society. If you're listening to an audio-only version of this episode, you won't benefit from the photos and slides that help tell the story. The presentation, including photos and other slides, is available on YouTube. Go there and search for View from a Hearse Podcast. This is Bruce Goddard, and you're listening to or watching the View from a Hearse Podcast.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.
I think it was during COVID-19 that Jamie Whitley and I started a Facebook page called Old Rentals. We started with just the two of us, and now the group is over 1,300. We began to do a lot of research, looking for old pictures and reading old publications of the Butler Herald online. Others quickly joined in and started submitting stories of families and businesses of the past. It became a group project, and now it is priceless, and hopefully it will be an invaluable resource for people who come after us. When someone posts something, someone else who might have more or better information would add to the post as a comment, and the post just gets better and more accurate. I learned that history is not a science. It is an art. It is the art of selecting and arranging facts to make them tell a story. Our facts came from old newspapers and first-hand accounts, and both can be questioned. Arranging those facts to tell a story can sometimes be a process. This was undoubtedly the case as I began looking at the story of the Coolik family in Reynolds. Being a fourth-generation Reynolds man, I had heard of the Cooliks all my life, and I knew they were an essential part of Reynolds' story. I wondered how an immigrant Jewish family could or would be accepted in a small conservative town where everybody knew everybody, and the town was segregated entirely by race. I was convinced that Reynolds was a special place, not because I grew up there, but because of the successful people who came out of that small town. Was Reynolds ahead of its time? I had read in a Butler Herald article that a lady named Florine English was elected mayor of Reynolds in 1952. A woman mayor in 1952? She also was a member of the Unitarian Church. Maybe Reynolds was ahead of its time. There were Methodist and Baptist churches back to back in the park. She had to be the only member of a Unitarian church. But back to the Cooliks. My daddy used to talk about Sammy Coolik. They were the same age, born in 1918, grew up together in Reynolds, played golf together, left for college together, and were lifelong friends. But that was about all I knew. As I looked at old newspapers online, the story became more interesting. How did this Jewish family become so accepted and integral to Reynolds? Why did they choose Reynolds? Where did they come from? Could they speak English when they arrived? Did they have other family here? I noticed that Oscar Dreizin was listed as the co-manager in the Butler Herald advertisement of the store they opened in Reynolds, called Globe Outfitters. Who was Oscar Dreizin? I spent many hours researching this family and even found and began communicating with some of their family. The more I learned, the more intrigued and impressed I became. As the story developed, I made several Facebook posts. The Coolik family did not know all this family history either, and were as interested as I was in learning what I was discovering. Last summer, Sam Coolik contacted me and said that the Coolik family wanted to come to Reynolds and asked if I could meet them there to show them around. Of course, I did, but before I showed them around, we met for lunch, and afterward, I did a little presentation about what I learned about their family, and even made a video later and posted it on YouTube. A few weeks later, I ran into a friend, Cody Rustin, by chance in Butler. He told me he had seen the stuff online about the Cooliks and that his mother had the memoirs written by Oscar Dreizin. He said he had been looking for the typewritten document but could not find it. He said he would continue to look. We exchanged numbers. A few weeks later, Cody called me to tell me he had found the 159-page document. I drove to Butler the next day, and we scanned it into a PDF. When I got back home, I read the entire book that night. I took away a few things from that book. First, Oscar Dreizin's incredible story of the American dream is movie material. I could not put it down and did not want it to end. Secondly, I learned more from his story and gained more information than before. When I began researching the Cooliks, I did so because of their importance to Reynolds and my family. After reading Oscar Dreizin's story, I realized that both stories needed to be woven together to understand the real story. I knew that the Coolik and Dreizin families, who were Jews, lived and made a living in Taylor County for 28 years, beginning in 1918, and they made a significant impact here. So who were they? How did they end up in Taylor County? What impact did they make? I will attempt to answer some of those questions. I learned that Oscar Dreizin was born in 1891 in Coolik, in the province of Visbik, in northwestern Russia, in what was known as White Russia. Coolik was a small town, and about 65% of the residents were Jewish. Coolik is now in what is known as Belarus. David Coolik was born 6 years prior in the same area in 1885. I am not exactly sure where he was born, but I saw one record that Dave's brother was born in Vilna, Russia, now Vilnius, Lithuania, which is now about a 3.5-hour drive from Coolik. Maybe Dave was born there as well, but I'm not sure. Dave Coolik migrated to the United States in 1901 at 16 years of age. Oscar Dreizin migrated to the United States 3 years later in 1904. He was 13 years old. That trip from Russia to New York City would have taken about a month. I know Oscar traveled by himself. I don't know if Dave came with family members or not, but that was a long trip for kids. Oscar's older brother, Louis, was the first of his family to migrate to the United States. Louis was only 17 when Oscar arrived in New York City. He met him at Ellis Island. Oscar knew no English. I have no idea how they found each other at Ellis Island. Over the following years, Oscar worked several jobs in Manhattan's Lower East Side called the Jewish Ghetto. He cleaned dormitories and made suitcases, but eventually left and moved to Sheboygan, Wisconsin, after a stay in Chicago. Oscar had a cousin there who turned out to be very poor, but Oscar became a Wisconsin businessman peddling brooms. He never got an education because he needed to make money to survive. Oscar was doing well in Wisconsin and began seeing a girl and fell in love. The girl suddenly got sick and passed away. Distraught, Oscar returned to New York City and lived with his brother and family and worked for several months making suitcases again. Living below them was his cousin, Annie Dreizin Coolik. Her husband was Izzy Coolik, who was David Coolik's younger brother. Izzy was a tailor, and his store was across the street from where they lived on Henry Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Oscar saw a young girl at the Cooliks downstairs who quickly caught his eye. Her name was Becky Coolik, and she was the younger sister of Izzy and David Coolik. Oscar promptly developed feelings for Becky. Just as that happened, Oscar was introduced to a man named Uncle S.B. Friedman, who was Becky Coolik's uncle. He was operating a store in Hazelhurst, Georgia, and was in New York City on a buying trip. He quickly liked Oscar and asked him to come to Georgia to work for him. He said he would teach him the business and help him get his own store to make a great living. The next thing Oscar knew, Becky left with Uncle Friedman to join him and his wife in Georgia. Oscar had been in the United States for about 11 years. He was disgusted with New York and decided to move south. His brothers tried to talk him out of it, but he was ready. Izzy knew Oscar had a thing for his younger sister and took Oscar to a jeweler friend and got him a good deal on an engagement ring to take to Georgia. In 1915, Oscar bought a train ticket and headed to Georgia with the engagement ring. A few months later, on January 30th, 1916, Oscar Dreizin and Becky Coolik married in Hazelhurst, Georgia. It was a huge Jewish wedding with over 500 guests, all paid for by Uncle S.B. Friedman. Oscar continued to work for Uncle Friedman, but things began to go wrong. He began to see the handwriting on the wall. He believed Uncle Friedman was blowing smoke about helping him to open a new store. Another cousin had overheard a conversation between Uncle Friedman and another man. Uncle Friedman stated that Oscar wanted him to open a store with Dave Coolik, but he would never do that. Turns out that Dave Coolik had been in business with Uncle Friedman in Lumber City, Georgia, but they had had a falling out. Dave had gone back to New York City and was selling insurance. It was obvious that Dave Coolik had been in business in Georgia for several years. Oscar and Becky left the Friedmans in Hazelhurst and moved to Eastman to work with another relative. The relative promised Oscar that if he came to work for him, he would do everything possible to help him start a business when he was ready by providing some merchandise at his cost. Oscar began working in Eastman and soon wrote to his brother-in-law, Dave Coolik, who was educated and an experienced businessman and had been in Georgia, and asked him to come back to Georgia and go in business with him. Dave agreed and returned to Georgia to look for a place to open a new business with Oscar. Before returning to Georgia, Dave Coolik married Sophie Aronson in the Bronx in New York City on August 1st, 1917. When Dave returned to Georgia, he immediately began looking for towns in Georgia to open a business. I have read that Dave had worked for a company out of New York City called Globe Outfitters and was a scout, and so he was experienced in looking for places to open a business. Dave Coolik discovered rentals. He came back and told Oscar that this town was bustling. It had 3 banks, 3 large stores, and many smaller stores. Taylor County was a large county that raised a lot of cotton and peaches. Dave and Oscar returned to rentals and spent a week and found that A.J. Crawford was ready to close his business. Since they hardly had any capital, Oscar talked Mr. Crawford into remodeling the store to get it ready for a merchandise store, and he added 10% to the rent to pay for the remodeling. This picture was taken in 1918 when Dave Coolik and Oscar Dreizin opened their business in Reynolds, and it is precisely what they saw on their first visit to Reynolds. Mr. Crawford was the Ford dealer. Globe Outfitters' grand opening was on August the 1st, 1918, under the ownership of Dave Coolik and Oscar Dreizin. They were amazed at how the other merchants welcomed them to Reynolds with open arms. The other merchants even helped them get their stock in place. They found Reynolds to be a very friendly town. Remember, they were Jewish people who spoke in broken English, being welcomed into a small conservative southern town. Globe Outfitters did $3,000 in business the first weekend. That would be about $63,000 in 2025. They sold almost everything they had. Mr. Coolik took a train to Savannah Saturday night to purchase enough stock to open on Monday. Dave Coolik and Oscar Dreizin had negotiated a deal with the telephone exchange company who occupied the space upstairs in their building for them to live there. The four lived upstairs at that store together. Becky and Sophie took turns cooking. Remember, Dave Coolik and Becky Dreizin were siblings. Oscar said they worked all day and night, lived like dogs, and slept above the store. Oscar was drafted into the Army, World War I, just as they got the business going, and his wife found out she was pregnant with her first child, Bessie. When he left for the exam, he told Dave Coolik, "Whatever happens to me, please take care of your sister. Forget that she is my wife, but remember, she is your sister." It turned out that the Army rejected Oscar because of flat feet, so he returned to Reynolds. Business continued to be excellent in Reynolds. According to the 1920 census, all four had moved out of the store. The Cooliks owned a home next to the Ficklings on South Winston Street. Oscar and Becky rented a house on South Collins Street that later became the Joe Goodrow home. I also know in 1919, Dave Coolik's younger brother, Louis Coolik, moved to Reynolds with the Cooliks, and he was educated in Reynolds. His name will come up later. Also in 1920, business was so good that Dave and Oscar decided to open another store in Butler. They matched silver coins to see who would manage the new store in Butler. Oscar said he lost and had to go to Butler. Neither wanted to leave Reynolds at the time. According to Oscar, Butler had more stores than customers, and at the time, Reynolds' retail revenues were 3 times greater than Butler's. Oscar and Dave went to Butler and rented a store building across from the courthouse that belonged to Mr. R.S. West. Their reception in Butler was not so welcoming at first. One of the most prominent merchants said, "I'll give that Jew 6 months to stay in business." The new Globe Outfitters store was opened in Butler on March the 1st, 1920, exactly 2 years after they opened the store in Reynolds. They took in $300 their first weekend, compared to the $3,000 in Reynolds. This is a photo of Oscar and Becky Dreizin in their store in Butler with Walter Jarrell, who worked for them part-time and would later work full-time at this store. Business improved, but the market dropped after Dave Coolik made a buying trip to New York. They couldn't sell all their new stock for what they paid. The Cooliks and Dreizins fell on hard times. Soon, Oscar became deathly ill with typhoid fever. Dr. Turk treated him. Oscar almost died and was very sick for 3 months, unable to work at all. During this time, Oscar considered dissolving the partnership with his brother-in-law, Dave Coolik. The rumor was that Sophie Coolik told others in town that her husband Dave had to do the work of 2 people, and Dave had to look after 2 families. Sophie also commented that Oscar's children dressed like kings and queens, a lot better than her children dressed. Oscar, who was independent and a little hard-headed, did not like what he had heard. Soon after Oscar got on his feet, he and Dave had a disagreement about the merchandise Dave had bought for the stores. Oscar told him he wanted to dissolve the partnership. When the lawyers drew up the contract, Oscar's lawyer, Mr. Foy, pointed out that there was non-compete language in the contract. In other words, the contract stated that Oscar could not open a store in Reynolds and Dave could not open a store in Butler. Dave Coolik wanted to keep the non-compete language in the contract. Oscar did not want it in there. Dave's attorney, Brown Marshall, solved the disagreement by having a group of prominent men mediate the dispute. The mediators were Roscoe Hinton, chosen by Oscar, C.H. Neisler, picked by Dave, and H.K. Seeley, picked by Brown Marshall. These were movers and shakers in Reynolds and Taylor County at the time. They agreed to remove the non-compete clause from the contract. The partnership between Dave Coolik and Oscar Dreizin was dissolved in late September 1922, about 6 months after opening the new store. Globe Outfitters in Reynolds became Coolik's store. You can see the Coolik sign on that store building. And the store in Butler became Dreizin's store. That name can still be seen today in Butler at the entrance of their building. In reading Oscar's memoirs, it appears they all were now enemies, and there was no doubt there was tension between Dave and Oscar. But I noticed in the Butler Herald that they visited each other and had meals together quite often. The good news for Oscar was that he got much busier, mainly due to Whittle and Slade Lumber Company, who came to town and employed several hundred people. Butler became a boom town. Business picked up big time for Oscar in Butler. 1923 and 1924 were great years until the bank started breaking, mainly due to decreasing cotton prices. Also, the Ku Klux Klan was organizing, and several merchants joined it. Oscar heard that one of their missions was to put the Jew out of business. Oscar did not have an education, but he was very astute. When he heard a certain person had joined the KKK, he would hire his daughter to work in the store. That strategy worked because most of the Klansmen traded with Oscar. Meanwhile, Coolik's store continued to thrive in Reynolds. I don't know how Dave Coolik dealt with the KKK in Reynolds, but I know he had to. But I do know that he became significantly involved in Reynolds, became a wealthy man, and a true leader in the community. By 1925, Dave Coolik was listed as the vice president of the Citizens State Bank of Reynolds. Charlie Neisler was president and founder, and one of the most affluent people who ever came out of Reynolds in Taylor County. Dave Coolik was also the best friend of another affluent Reynolds man named Brown Marshall. Dave was part of the core group that helped Brown start the Reynolds Golf Course, which still exists today and will celebrate its 100th anniversary in a few years. This picture is some of the Coolik family standing in front of the pro shop last summer. As far as the Cooliks fitting socially into Reynolds community, they did. They were involved in everything in Reynolds and became community leaders and hosted social events in their home. In Butler, Oscar built his reputation after his trouble in the 20s, and he and Becky were also fully involved in the community of Butler. For example, Becky served as chaperone at the school prom. They hosted a prom party for Aaron's class and hosted bridal parties for local brides in their home. Oscar served on the city council for several terms and was active in the Masons, serving as treasurer for several years. He was also a major contributor to the school system. In 1930, Oscar's store burned to the ground, and they lost everything. Oscar built a new store, bigger and better than the first. People came from all around to the grand opening. Oscar was rocking and rolling in Butler. When Oscar and Becky announced Bessie's engagement to be married, they threw a party at their home. There was an extensive write-up in the paper, and it appeared everyone in Butler was there. Another example of Oscar Dreizin standing in the community and success was when he loaned $1,400, equivalent to $30,000 today, to Austin Gwynn Sr. in 1936. Just coming out of the Great Depression, the bank would not lend him the needed money, I assume. Because of Oscar, Austin Gwynn became world famous in the chicken business. That is another story worth exploring. Now I want to mention a few of Dave Coolik's friends to illustrate his standing in Reynolds and his impact on the community. I'll start with Brown Marshall. We've already talked about his friendship with Dave Coolik. For example, when Morris Coolik, Izzy Coolik's son, married in Tampa, Brown Marshall traveled with Dave Coolik to the wedding. Getting to Tampa back then was not as easy as today. Interestingly, Brown was a staunch Methodist who was instrumental in building the beautiful church today. Dave Coolik was Jewish. That did not stop or even impede their close friendship. We have also mentioned that Brown was Dave's attorney. Brown was a smart one. He entered Mercer University at 13, attended the University of Georgia Law School, and completed his law degree at Columbia University in New York City. He was a world-class track and field star at Georgia and Columbia, and declined an invitation to join the United States Olympic team. In addition to being a shrewd lawyer and community leader, he drove the first motorized vehicle ever in Reynolds in 1903, about 15 years before Dave Coolik and Oscar Dreizin arrived on the scene. A fellow lawyer described Brown Marshall as modest, unobtrusive, a scholar, and well-versed in the law. He had a gentle manner, yet strong and tenacious of the right and firm in convictions. Brown was also the person who brought golf to Reynolds. As we have already mentioned, Dave Coolik helped Brown's idea of golf become a reality in 1929. He is a picture of the Dave Coolik Trophy. The Coolik family's golfing bug began at the Reynolds Golf Club. Another close friend and confidant of Dave Coolik was Charlie Neisler. Charlie was a large landowner, farmer, entrepreneur, and philanthropist in Taylor County, owning over 3,000 acres. He owned an extensive cattle range of white-faced Hereford cattle, a large peach grower, and owned and operated a cotton warehouse, fertilizer mixing plant, and a car dealership. He was a much in-demand speaker. Charlie was active in politics at the local and state levels, serving as a state senator and later on the staff of Governor L.G. Hardman. He was encouraged to run for governor, but he never did. After forming the First National Bank earlier, Charlie Neisler later founded the Citizen State Bank. Interestingly, Charlie chose Dave Coolik to be the vice president of the Citizen State Bank, proving that Dave Coolik had not only done well in Reynolds, but had become friends and business partners with its most successful people. I also will mention my grandfather and great-grandfather in this conversation. E.A. Goddard moved to Butler after the Civil War and then soon moved to Reynolds and started a business that stayed in the Goddard family for 131 years. My grandfather joined him in the business around the turn of the century. When Oscar Dreizin wrote about moving to Reynolds, he mentioned 3 large stores already in town, including the Reynolds Mercantile Company, Barrow Brothers, and Goddard Store. They all 3 were competitors, but they also were friends. I read in the Butler Herald that E.A. Goddard was a guest and attended a large Jewish wedding held at the Coolik home. I also read several times that my grandparents and the Cooliks often traveled together to Taubleton to visit relatives. These 2 immigrant couples came to America on a hope and a prayer, and through extremely hard work and persistence, created a life for themselves and their children. And that continues today with all the successful Cooliks and Dreizins nationwide. I will briefly mention the Coolik and Dreizin's children to understand the American dream fully coming to fruition. For starters, they had 8 children between them. All grew up in Taylor County and were honor graduates at the local public schools in Reynolds and Butler. Also, every one of them obtained a college degree. Remember, Oscar Dreizin began fending for himself as a child and never had the time to receive an education, leaving him with a minimal ability to read and write. He and Becky produced 4 children who grew up in Butler. The oldest child was Bessie. She was a 1935 honor graduate of Butler High School and a graduate of the University of Georgia. She was elected president of the Panhellenic Council at the University of Georgia. She married David Satloff of Columbus. He was a successful businessman in Columbus as the owner of Satloff Auto Parts and later founded Standard Units Company, Inc., an auto parts manufacturing company. He and Bessie raised 4 girls. Their second child, Miriam, was a 1937 honor graduate of Butler High School and a graduate of the University of Georgia, and was part of the faculty at Butler High School for a short time. She married Izzy Channing of Macon. The Channing family owned and operated Stevens in Macon. At one time, they had 8 store locations in Middle Georgia while maintaining an office in New York City. They were well-known philanthropists and community leaders in Macon. Isaac Ike Dreizin was the youngest son of Oscar and Becky. He was a 1942 honor graduate of Butler High School and also graduated from Emory University. He was a veteran of World War II, receiving officer training at Columbia University. He was a recognized community leader in Macon. He and his wife, Elaine, had 3 daughters. Staff Sergeant Aaron Dreizin was a 1939 honor graduate of Butler High School and graduated from Middle Georgia in Cochran before enlisting in the U.S. Army. He made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. He was killed in action on January 30th, 1944. The President of the United States posthumously awarded him the Air Medal Citation for his exceptional, meritorious achievement while participating in 5 separate bomber combat missions over enemy-occupied continental Europe. The courage, coolness, and skill displayed by this enlisted man upon those occasions reflect great credit upon himself and the armed forces of the United States, and that was part of the citation. As for the Cooliks, Sam graduated from Vanderbilt University and served honorably in the Navy in World War II. He had 3 children. Sam was an accomplished golfer and learned to play at the Reynolds Golf Course. Sam died young. Nora was a 1937 honor graduate of Reynolds High School and a graduate of the University of Georgia. She married Al Copeland of Macon, president of Macon Iron and Paper Stock, and they were very well known as community leaders in Macon. The Copelands had 3 children. Molly was a 1940 honor graduate of Reynolds High School and a graduate of the University of Alabama. She married Sidney Ginsburg of Montgomery. An international employment agency in Buckhead employed her for 30 years. They had 3 children. Edith was a 1942 honor graduate of Reynolds High School and a graduate of the University of Alabama. She married Hubert Besser, the founder of Besser Paper Company in Montgomery, which became Bestpak, with operations in Alabama and Texas. Edith became the CEO and chairman after her husband's death. She introduced the first biodegradable garbage bag while leading the company. She became famous. They had 4 daughters. Oscar and Becky had a tough time during the war. Their son had been killed, and their other son, along with both sons-in-law, were all in service, and they worried themselves sick. Oscar ended up having a stroke 7 months after Aaron was killed in August 1944. He was out of work for 6 weeks, and Miriam took over the store. Oscar stated that she ran it better than he did. She stopped extending credit and collected the outstanding accounts. Customers understood. On April the 10th, 1945, about 14 months after Aaron was killed, Oscar sold the store to Dave Coolik's younger brother, who was raised in Reynolds that we mentioned, Lewis, who had a store in Tobbleton. Dreizin's store became Coolik's store at that time. Oscar and Becky moved to Macon and retired. Oscar lived another 23 years and died in 1968. Becky died in 1977 in Macon. The next year, in 1946, Dave Coolik sold his store to Buster McDaniel and his home to the daughter of his good friend, Brown Marshall, who had died the previous year. Dave and Sophie left Reynolds and moved to Macon briefly, then to Montgomery, where they lived out their days. Dave died in 1957, and Sophie died in 1959 in Montgomery. I also wanted to add more information that makes this story even more interesting. I am positive this is just a drop in the bucket of what some of these grandchildren of these two families have accomplished. But I'm going to give you a few examples. Kerry Copeland, grandson of Dave Coolik, lives in New York City and is a prominent wealth management executive in Manhattan. Additionally, he's the president of an international group called the American Ditchley Foundation. Their mission is to promote global understanding and dialogue with nations around the globe. My point, Dave Coolik's family has come a long way from Ellis Island and the Jewish ghetto in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Robert Channon, grandson of Oscar and Becky Dreizin, was president of the Interfraternity Council at the University of Georgia. He was also on the golf team. He is an executive with a wealth management company in Macon and lives there. Among other accomplishments, he was a founding member of the First Macon Bank. Carla Copeland Cohn, granddaughter of Dave and Sophie Coolik, was the longtime personal assistant of Major League Baseball home run king Hank Aaron. She handled the personal hate mail that came to him when he was chasing Babe Ruth's record, and was a close friend of Hank and his family. The next lady you see is Jen Fallick, Dave Coolik's great-granddaughter. You've probably seen her on the Today Show. Her style and beauty segments were popular on the Today Show in New York City, and she still appears occasionally. The Cooliks and Dreizins lived in Taylor County for 28 years. They're a huge part of the Taylor County story. More importantly, their story of moving as immigrants from Russia to the United States as kids and doing what they had to do to make a life and create even greater lives for their children and grandchildren should never be forgotten. As an epilogue, after retirement and having a lot of time on his hands, Oscar Dreizin decided to do something he had always wanted to do, be more proficient at reading and writing. His Taylor County friend Fred Rustin owned a business school in Macon. Mildred Freeman, who would later become Fred Rustin's wife, taught in the school. Oscar humbled himself, started at grade level, and mastered the English language under Fred and Mildred's tutelage. After he finished, Oscar typed his memoirs at Fred and Mildred's request as part of his graduation assignment. He typed several copies to give to his family. He also typed a copy for Fred and Mildred Rustin as a thank you for the time they took with him. I was most fortunate to get my hands and eyes on that copy. If you want a copy of Oscar Dreizin's incredible story, send me your email address and I'll forward it to you. This is a quote from a poem, The Winds of Fate, by Ella Wheeler Wilcox. A ship sails east and a ship sails west by the same wind that blows. 'Tis not the wind, but the set of the sails that determine the way she goes. Dave Coolik's friend Charlie Neisler used that quote in a speech he gave at the Agricultural College at the University of Georgia and added these words: "In all lines of endeavor, it may be observed that one man succeeds while another, under what appears to be identical conditions, fails. This being the case, it is fair to assume that it's not the conditions, but whether they are properly or improperly applied to the undertaking that is responsible for the outcome. The conditions may be likened unto the wind of which the poet sings. Whether the undertaking moves forward toward success or backward toward failure depends upon the human agency behind it, to the manner in which its sails are set." And that is the story of the Coolik and Dreizin family. I found a recipe that has been in my family for years. I had no idea that it came from Sophie Coolik. It is a baked fish recipe. My mother used to make this. It is the best baked fish you will ever put in your mouth, and it's from Sophie Coolik's kitchen. So I'll leave with that. What a story, what a legacy.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh think and cry with the country undertaker.